Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gabrielle Doheny, and I sit on the Federation's Emerging Philanthropist Campaign Cabinet. Emerging Philanthropists, or EP, is the Federation's philanthropy space for those of us 40 and under. And the Ben Gurion Society, known as BGS, is the community for emerging philanthropists, giving $1,000 or more to the Federation's annual campaign. Being a part of our BGS community means you get access to homes, speakers, and our top leaders. And there are numerous opportunities to meet, network, and connect with high-level people in an exclusive environment. And it's all done through the lens of the work of the Jewish Federation. So I encourage all of you who are interested in joining BGS to reach out to Alyssa Brule, and she'll put her email address in the chat box so you guys can reach out. And I also want to recognize and thank our EP co-chairs, Brian Wasser and Tamara Kagel, as well as the rest of our EP campaign cabinet, Josh Backrack, Daniel Barkin, Hallie Brookman, Warren Coughlin, Shirley Tachteman, and Elise Worksman. And I will pass it to Tamara, who will give us a quick Federation update before introducing our speakers for tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Hi, everyone. I'm Tamara Kagel. I'm so honored to be an EP co-chair along with Brian Wasser. I am also a second-year cabinet member in Federation's National Young Leadership Cabinet Program, a 5-year National Philanthropic Leadership Development Program. Side note, that's actually where I met Eden. I am proud to support the life-changing work of the Federation for a number of reasons, caring for the Holocaust members of our community, providing PJ libraries for children and books and for families like my own, and events like this, which obviously could not be more timely or more needed. Our Federation identifies and addresses the greatest challenges and opportunities in our community, both locally and globally, especially in times of crisis, something we all know too well. Locally, our Los Angeles Federation is deeply concerned about the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism and direct attacks on Jews worldwide, including the hate crimes on Jews perpetrated by a pro-Palestinian mob in a Los Angeles restaurant just a few weeks ago. Our Community Security Initiative, CSI, which launched in 2012, works vigilantly with nearly 600 local Jewish organizations and in direct coordination with all levels of law enforcement to keep us protected. CSI does this work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Just recently, CSI worked directly with local law enforcement to make sure the perpetrators of the recent hate crimes were caught. CSI held an emergency briefing with elected officials, law enforcement, and Federation staff, in which over 1,200 community members registered and vital information was shared on how people can submit tips for anti-Semitic incidents and crimes in our community. And globally in Israel, our Federation has been working closely with our partners in light of recent events, specifically the Israel Trauma Coalition, to provide timely and much needed support, especially to the most vulnerable, including frail, elderly, families, and young children. While the imminent threat has passed, there is still much work to be done. So if you have yet to make a gift this year, or you feel inspired to give a little bit more, please do so at yajewishla.org/give. The link will be in the chat box. So we've made it very easy for you. You can click right there and donate. When our community came together earlier this year and decided we needed to talk about the rise of anti-Semitism, we had no idea how timely this conversation would end up becoming, given the events of the last few weeks. I'm sure all of you have stories about personally witnessing something online. So at this point, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow National Young Leadership Cabinet member, Eden Cohen. Eden is the president and founder of A Wider Frame, a bi-weekly newsletter created out of a desire to help educate, connect, and engage readers on issues important to the Jewish world. Brief anecdote about Eden starting A Wider Frame. I remember when she started it a few years ago, or a year ago, I'm sure you were, maybe just a few days after she started it, she was complaining to me that the number of people who had signed up for it were in the hundreds and worried about getting readers, fans, people interested. And now very quickly, last I checked, I believe that you were well over 15,000 people on Instagram alone. So congratulations, we're excited to see where it goes, and welcome Eden.
I started it right after an event I went to with Tamara, and we had a great conversation about something happening in Jewish news, and that actually led me to start it. So Tamara was a big part of it. Hey guys, I want to thank Federation for putting together this event and for including me. I started a wider frame, honestly, because quite frankly, I'm terrified. It's terrifying to me how little people understand what Jews are up against today. And it is just painfully obvious to me how much we desperately need literacy when it comes to anti-Semitism, our own history, our own peoplehood, and an understanding of what's happening today. And how much we really desperately need to find our own voices to speak out in our own defense. These conversations are absolutely critical right now, and Ben Freeman is a modern day Maccabee. He's an incredibly talented and effective educator. And when I have children, God willing, someday, I hope to be able to send them to the Ben M. Freeman School of Jewish Studies, which does not exist yet, but hopefully will soon. Born in Scotland, Ben is a gay Jewish author and internationally renowned educator focusing on Jewish identity, combating anti-Semitism, and raising awareness of the Holocaust. His first book, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, was released in February 2021, this year. Currently based in Hong Kong, Ben now heads up the humanities team at an American international school and lectures on anti-Semitism at Hong Kong universities. Through his work, he aims to educate, inspire, and empower both Jewish and non-Jewish people from all over the world. You can follow his work across all major social media platforms through @BenMFreeman. In Jewish Pride, Ben draws on his own experiences in the LGBTQ+ community to impart on the Jewish world the power in rejecting the shame of anti-Semitism imposed by the outside world. To start this off, I first want to recommend everyone here actually really read Ben's book if you haven't already. And now I'd like to turn it to you, Ben, to share a little bit more about the book and in what ways, if any, it touches on fighting anti-Semitism. Also, just would love to know what led you to become a Jewish scholar and advocate.
Well, firstly, thank you so much for your kind words. It's just really a pleasure to speak to you specifically and to be here to speak with all of you. I grew up in Glasgow, Scotland, in a very, very tiny Jewish community, very, very small, but we were very proud. We were very proudly Zionist and very proudly Jewish. And my father had me very late in life. He was 55 when he had me. So we always seemed to have one foot in the past. You know, the music that we listened to as a family was like Judy Garland or Ella Fitzgerald. So like from his, I guess, pop stars of his era, right? So I was always interested in history, and I was always particularly interested in Jewish history. And I understood from a very early age that even though I was part of this tiny Jewish community in Scotland, that A, I was connected to all the Jews around the world, and B, I was connected to our past. I felt a deep connection to the land of Israel, to people who came before us. And I've always been very proudly Jewish. I've always loved being Jewish. I've always, you know, someone on Twitter said a couple of weeks ago that it's like being in Harry Potter, and that we're the wizarding community in the Muggle world because we have our own newspapers, our own traditions, our own fights. And it really is like being part of something very special. It was tested when I went to university because Britain, unfortunately, with regards to, you know, anti-Jewish hate, is ahead of America. So we've been experiencing left-wing anti-Semitism for, I mean, really decades. And I experienced it at university. I was called every single day at the University of Glasgow, I was called a racist, a white supremacist, an imperialist, a colonizer. And I didn't really understand why, because the conversations we have now were not being had then. So I knew that it was offensive. I knew it made me feel alone and isolated, but I didn't necessarily understand it. But at the same time, I came out. I came out as gay. I started the journey of coming to terms with my sexual orientation. And I saw how these people, my university peers, who are generally on the left, how they embraced me for being gay, but rejected me for being a Jew. And I saw that firsthand. And I think that is something Jewish people who have intersecting identities see very often. And I had to go on a journey, as I said, to LGBTQ plus pride. And my Jewishness did take a back seat. You know, I was kind of willing to suppress it, perhaps, to make it less relevant, because I was coming to terms with who I was as a gay man. My first boyfriend was an anti-Semite. And I said, okay, it's fine, because, you know, I'm just desperate to be in a relationship because my coming out experience was so hard. But I think that at some point, I started to come back to my Jewishness. And my father passed away in 2017, and I'd been a Holocaust educator before that. I lived in Hong Kong as a Holocaust educator. And immediately following his passing, I just took a huge step back. I was like, I do not have the emotional capacity to be talking about the Holocaust, to be talking about anti-Semitism. And then I kind of came back to myself in the summer of 2018, and it was at the peak of Corbynism. So Corbynism was, named after Jeremy Corbyn, who was the Labour leader, the official opposition party in the UK for about 4 or 5 years. And I was horrified because I felt British. My dad, being much older, would always be like, okay, guys, when the national anthem plays, we have to stand up, even though he was half kidding. The Jewish community in the UK is very royalist. We're very loyal. We say prayers for the government and the royal family every single Shabbat. And we have made huge efforts to be British. And it was a moment of realization that, oh, this is not reciprocal. And actually, we all drank the Kool-Aid. We thought, oh, it's anti-Semitism is over. We're fine now. We've reached a place where we can be accepted. Nothing bad will ever happen to us again. And Corbyn showed us that was not the case. And it was really a trauma, and it was horrendous. And I joined Twitter especially to take part in that fight. People tried to get me fired from work. People called my work in Hong Kong from the UK to get me fired. So it's really, I was doxxed very early on. But again, I didn't even know what that was. I remember at the time being like, wow, that's so crazy. And then when I spoke to my partner, he was like, that's insane. And I was like, oh, you're right, it is insane. Because there's so much that we just accept as what it means to be a Jew, what it means to be a Jew online. So much about these things, we're like, oh, this is just part of it. But actually, that is not acceptable. It's not acceptable that our lives are made harder just because of this specific identity we have. And I saw the British Jewish community on one hand embody Jewish pride. We came together, we put aside our differences, and we said literally enough is enough, and we would not stop talking about it. And we campaigned hard. But I also saw, not unlike what we just saw with Seth Rogen, actually, we also saw high-profile left-wing Jews who would not say it for what it was. They were suffering from what I call the hangover of the keep your head down policy, which is probably all of our context. So just keep your head down, get on with it, don't say anything. And I guess maybe because I'm a bit obnoxious and I'm mouthy, but I've just never been able to do that. My partner said yesterday, I was like, I have an opinion about this. And he was like, you have an opinion? I just always have something to say. And I could never keep my head down. And I thought, this is so damaging that we've been taught to do this. And I actually think it's a massive, manifestation of internalized anti-Semitism. So all of these experiences really led me to think, well, we need a pride movement. We need to be given permission, all of us, to love ourselves, to be proud of ourselves, and to say, no, we're not going to accept that. We're not going to accept you saying these things about us, and we're certainly not going to believe them about ourselves. So that was really the process. And it's funny because the book is not about fighting anti-Semitism. I say this very often, but actually the first 4 chapters deal with anti-Semitism, because that has been one of the defining factors in the identity and our identity being made and being formed. And I wanted to explain to people what is being said about us, why is it being said, why is it still an issue thousands of years later, and how has it impacted us, and how have we responded? So there's a chapter on acculturation, and it specifically looks at the French, the German, and the American Jewish communities. There's a chapter on internalized anti-Semitism, because that's also something we have to recognize. Because while our Jewish pride movement is about us, and it's about empowering us and understanding ourselves, we cannot ignore the fact that we're also a product of this hate that is imposed onto us.
I have a quick follow-up question. When you were finding your voice in all of this and finding your footing, did you feel supported by someone? Did you have a group of people that kind of helped you do this? Or was it really something you just took on yourself?
So my partner, who isn't Jewish actually, was incredibly supportive. And he really is. And he's stunned because he's not Jewish, so he doesn't expect these things. So when I get death threats, he's like, what? People are saying these things to you? And I found a community online. And I think that is something that we also have to recognize. While the technology has always been used to advance anti-Jewish hate, and the internet is certainly an example of that, we're also all coming together. I live in Hong Kong, you're in the East Coast, Eden, everyone else is in the West Coast. We're using the internet for good. And I think that we've also been given this kind of unprecedented opportunity to really reform our peoplehood in a very real and tangible way. And I formed a community. So I formed a community of other British advocates, American advocates. So yeah, I did feel supported, but it is isolating because we are minorities. And we're numerically a minority. So we might go to, we're having this wonderful conversation. Tomorrow I will go to work and be the only Jewish person there. So that does impact how I feel about myself, my Jewishness. So the community that we're forming is kind of a lifeline to me and to many, many people, I think.
100%. I feel the same way. To back up just a little bit, because you're such a great educator on this, and I don't want to presume to know how much anybody really knows about the history of this. I think it's valuable for everyone to hear from you on this. And I know we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'll try to make it quick. But as far as a few basics and misconceptions about historical and modern day anti-Semitism, can you just explain a little bit, what is it, what fuels it, why it's exploded on social media? And also, as far as historically, has it changed shape or has it not? And also, can you touch on that idea, the idea of Jewish privilege? Because I think a lot of people want to understand how that comes into it as well.
So I might start backwards because there was a lot of instructions there, and I also will try and speak quickly, but not too quickly. So Jewish privilege is awful. It doesn't exist. We may have advantage and or disadvantage because of ourselves. So I am a light-skinned man. That gives me certain advantage in the world. But I'm also gay and Jewish, which gives me disadvantage or disadvantages me. So this idea of Jewish privilege is a modern manifestation of an idea that is literally thousands of years old. And this is what people need to understand, that they have been saying these things about us for literally ever. We're privileged, we're powerful, all we care about is money, all we care about is each other and conspiring against the non-Jewish world. So that is just a modern manifestation of that. I think actually a lot of people don't understand anti-Semitism, and that I think is a real problem. And we understand it from our specific context. It's not specific to 2021, it's not specific to the 1930s, it's not left, it's not right. It is deeply embedded in our societies. And actually more than that, it played a foundational role in building our societies, which does also make it different to kind of other forms of hate. So what I mean by that, the non-Jewish world, specifically the Christian and the Muslim, which really covers huge swathes of the world, used Jews to define their identities, but they used concepts of Jews. So this has actually nothing to do with us as individuals. This is about concepts of us. So let's look at a very early example. The early Christians did this. And this was a marketing exercise. They were Jews originally, and they were not disregarding the Torah. So they had to offer an explanation as to why we're now Christian, why we're no longer Jews. So they positioned themselves against us. If the Jews are going to keep kosher, we're not going to keep kosher. If the Jews are going to circumcise, we're not going to circumcise. And then it became theological. The Jews are physical, we're spiritual. The Jews are practical, we're heavenly. And then that became this concept called adversos Judaeos, which literally translates as against Jews. And this was spread all over the Roman Empire because Rome converted to Christianity. So Christianity, which was steeped in anti-Jewish hate, became this political force. And it's kind of similar in the Muslim world. That embedded this hate in society. So I see people today saying anti-Semitism is political. I think that's actually a misreading. Anti-Jewish hate, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish racism, whatever you want to call it, and there are different names more applicable to specific time periods, but anti-Jewish hate is a part of society. It's a part of the ideology, the culture, the social norms of the world in which we live. So it's expressed at grassroots level, like we were talking about before. It's expressed in social media. It's expressed by politicians. It's utilized by despots. It is kind of all-encompassing, and it has four main manifestations. One is economic libel, which is the money accusation. Blood libel, which is really the accusation that we're the center of evil. Conspiracy fantasy, conspiring to control the world. And then racial libel, which is a demonization of the concept of Jewish shared ancestry or how we look, because our physicality is meant to represent our souls, which are, according to the non-Jews, evil. And I think that we feel like it's our job to fight it. And of course, this is about fighting anti-Semitism online, so to an extent it is. But the reality is, like any other social movement, it really requires the majority to take it on. So it's not actually our problem. It really is the non-Jewish world's problem. And I open the book from this quote by my late father, and it's, "The non-Jewish world hates Jews." And, you know, sometimes, you know, I'm like, is that true? Am I speaking too forcefully? And then we see events of the past few weeks, and I was like, nope, my dad was spot on. And it does. And we're not talking about individual non-Jewish people. My partner is an amazing ally, but we're talking about the society and the world in which we live. And it also impacts us. We can also internalize it. So it's a fantasy. It's deeply embedded in society. And you asked if it changes. One of my students said last year that it's the same soup, different bowl. So the content always stays the same. Always. So accusations that Israel was, you know, purposely murdering Palestinian children, that's blood libel. It's like, no, it isn't. And actually, that is quite a severe accusation. That's not a normal thing to accuse a country of. So you're accusing Israel of being unnatural, barbaric, perverse, inhumane. That's blood libel. So the content stays the same. However, the bowl, how it is expressed, always fits the zeitgeist. So if we look at anti-Semitism from the Middle Ages, it does look on the surface a bit different to anti-Semitism expressed by the Nazis or by today, or by people today, but actually it's really the same content. And that's really important, because we have to understand what we're experiencing. We have to understand what we're up against. We're facing this, you know, multi-headed snake, and we can't even identify it. And I think that sometimes we try to intellectualize it and be like, oh, as I said, oh, it's political, or it's left, or it's right. And it's like, no, it is in the ground in which we're standing. And it's quite frightening. And you know, Simon Sebag Montefiore, the great British author, read my book very kindly, and he said, it's very inspiring, but it is very depressing. Because I think being Jews in the non-Jewish world, in the diaspora, it is depressing. Because at some point we have to wake up to the fact that the societies in which we live are kind of designed to hate us. And they utilize us in ways which have nothing to do with us. So I wrote an article recently about the Bogart, which is a character from Harry Potter. And no one knows what the character looks like, and it takes the shape of whoever is looking at it fears most. So for me, it's snakes. For you, Eden, it might be spiders. And that is the role we play. Because it's not about us. We are a construct, which is mad because we're also individuals. But that's why we're white and not white. We're rich, we're poor. We're, you know, the intelligentsia, we're beggars on the street. We're capitalists, we're communists. We represent all things to all people, and we are the ultimate scapegoat. And I do believe actually that anti-Jewish hate is unique because A, of how long it has lasted, and B, the purpose that it serves. So it's strange because it targets us as individuals. Every single one of us, I think, was watching the last month just with open mouths being like, what is happening? This is horrifying. And it impacts us, and it has impacted lives of Jews for millennia, but it is not actually about us, which is...
To follow up on that, and maybe you can touch on this a little, even though it's not our problem, is it our problem to solve?
I think we play a role in the solving of it, which is the reason we're here, right? But I think we also have to be realistic. I saw someone online say, America, you can defeat anti-Semitism. And I was kind of like, no, of course you can't. It's like, no disrespect, none of us can. It's the non-Jewish world needs to solve it. We play a part in it. And this is why this event is so important. Part of Jewish pride is knowing that we're allowed to advocate for ourselves, knowing that we're allowed to say, no, you're not going to treat us like this. We're not going to accept it, and we will advocate for ourselves, and we'll be able to defend ourselves and our future. So that is the role that we play. But I don't think that it's our specific job to solve it. It often falls on us. And you know, this is a really wonderful event, but I presume it's mostly Jewish people, right? You know, that it's really difficult because we have these conversations internally and we're educating ourselves, which is really important and is a major component of Jewish pride. But the people who also need to hear this are non-Jews. But as David Baddiel said, just, you know, in February, Jews don't count. So we have a lot of, it's a very complex field to get people to listen to us.
No, I agree with you. But I agree with you. It's not just our problem, but I think there is such a lack of education and a lack of understanding that we need to understand it ourselves before we want anyone else to.
I went off yesterday. I went off at my partner. No, I was ranting to him because I heard a story that a Jewish teacher asked him. They said to him, "What is my ethnicity?" And my partner was like, "Well, you're Jewish, right?" And she was like, No, I think I'm Caucasian." And he was like, "Well, did you choose to be Jewish, or were you born Jewish? Like, what is your story?" And she was like, "No, I was born Jewish. Everyone I know in my family was Jewish." And he's like, "So then your ethnicity is Jewish?" And I like lost it because I was like, that person needs to, like, I really was quite aggressive. I was like, this person is a danger to our community because we have people in positions of responsibility educating who do not understand what it means to be a Jew. And I'm not talking about the halakha, I'm not talking about observance, I'm talking about what are we at our core. And we're
for this education.
Say again?
I guess the question really is the flaws in Jewish education and where do people go?
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of crazy that people are going to this Instagram and Twitter to learn about their identities. I do think that we have to recognize that particularly probably our generation or the generation that taught us, they failed. And we're not going to judge them too harshly because they were responding to a very specific circumstance, which post-Holocaust. And actually, we can see patterns emerge across kind of different peoples that in the period after a catastrophe, a lot of people retreat and they want to assimilate. And actually, we follow the pattern of the next generation being like, no, screw that. But the fact that there are Jews who do not understand what it means to be a Jew, I find to be horrifying. And actually, we need a curriculum overhaul. Like, how are Jewish centers, how are they teaching?
Freeman School of Jewish Studies.
Yeah, I've never heard that before, but maybe because it really is horrifying. It's like you get people saying to me, like, and I don't identify as white. I will say that I'm Jewish and I am light-skinned or I pass as white. And also as a non-American, I don't really appreciate American binaries being imposed onto me as a British Jew. But I think that even for American Jews, you get to define your own identities. And I would say to people, my Black friends in Hong Kong would be like, well, you don't experience what we experience. I was like, no, absolutely not. But you don't experience what I experience. And my identity is not defined by your experience. My identity is defined by my experience. And these coexist at the same time. And I think, again, that's part of this advocacy. Jews are allowed to have self-determination, not just with regards to our statehood, but with regards to our identities and our concepts. We're allowed to identify as Jews. Not good Jews, not bad Jews, just Jews.
Well, I'm curious when and at what point stopped becoming an option to check on all of the forms in the US. And I know we've talked about this before. And then one more thing I wanted you to point out is how anti-Jewish hate is viewed in Britain and how it is viewed here as being opposed to the religious aspect of Jews versus a type of racism, because I don't know that a lot of people understand that.
Yeah, so I'm kind of on a one-man mission to stop using the word anti-Semitism, and I actually do a very poor job of it because it's habitual. I wrote an article about anti-Jewish racism because anti-Semitism in Europe and the UK is understood to be a form of racism. Because racism isn't just rooted in race, it's rooted in ethnicity. So we are an ethnic minority. I mean, that is not up for debate. We qualify for all of those kind of check boxes. So in the UK, we are understood to be victims of racism. And again, because we don't have the same context, and it's not that Britain didn't commit any of the crimes, Britain committed all these crimes just away from Britain. But we don't have this context, which the world is split into black and white. We have people of all different ethnicities in the UK, as of course you do in America, but all of these identities are recognized. So yeah, people in the street would probably say, oh, you're white, just because of the way I look, which is fine. But they would also understand that as a Jew, I can be a victim of racism, because actually the hate that targets us rarely targets us for our beliefs. And I got into a fight with this rabbi online who was, when I said this, he was like, so are you saying there's no Jewish hate against the religious? I was like, no, of course there is. But you're not being targeted because you believe in one God. You're not being targeted because of the halakha. You're being targeted because you're a Jew. And what does it mean to be a Jew? And these characteristics are all inherent. And it's, just a modern kind of softer way of eugenics. The Nazis talked about biology and pseudoscience. People today just talk about you are a Jew. And it's the same idea that this is in our blood, this is just who we are, and that then impacts how we're to be treated. And yes, of course, I think people can convert out, but we've also seen cases where people can convert out or people converting out and still being targeted as Jews. I mean, look at the Spanish Jews of the Inquisition. They were still murdered after they were forced to convert. So again, this is something that we need to understand. And again, it's Jews. And you have to be sensitive to the world around you, right? You're not going to, it's tricky, but you also are allowed to define your own hate. You're allowed to define your own identities and say, well, that what happens to another community does not shape my identity, and it doesn't shape what happens to me. Because actually there's similarities between anti-Black racism, anti-Jewish racism, enormous similarities between anti-Asian racism and anti-Jewish racism. The way that men are portrayed, the way that women are portrayed, they're very, very similar. And to misunderstand that it's just a religious form of hate means that we can convert out of it.
The word anti-Semitism was actually created in order to emphasize the racial aspect of it, which I think people don't understand as well.
Yeah, and that was the first time that it really became about us as individuals, because it was still conceptual, but it targeted Jewish bodies because it's a racist term. It was rooted in pseudoscience that if you spoke Hebrew, which is a Semitic language, then certain things could be inferred about your biology. It's like, well, that's wrong, and it's also racist. Sure. And it was they switched out of Judenhass, which was Jew hate, to make it sound more intellectual, because again, it always fits the world in which it is expressed.
And it's interesting. Even the FBI and the states consider anti-Semitism a type of religious hate, not a type of racist hate.
Yeah, and it's deeply frustrating.
Yeah.
Because we also get to define it ourselves. When I'm called a dirty Jew, or when people tell me to go and shoot myself, they're not saying it because they really dislike what I say, although they might also dislike what I say. They're saying it because I'm a Jew. And I'm like, just get to know me and then hate me. You know, you don't need to hate me just because I'm a Jew, because, you know, I'm actually quite lovely. But they don't care. And they've never cared. And this is the thing, what we're experiencing today is just a modern repeat of what came before. And I do think we have to start, and it'd be so fascinating to talk to your dad about this, who's also a Holocaust educator, but how we begin to talk about the German Jews and the Jews of that period and how we start to learn lessons internally. Because someone said, you know, Auschwitz was not a university. And when people say, oh, Jews should have learned the lesson, that elicits an enormous cuss word for me that I shan't say in polite society. But it's not acceptable. It's like, no, actually, we have nothing to learn. You've got something to learn about not murdering us. But sure, there are lessons for us and how we view ourselves, how we understand the world around us, but it's a different thing.
For sure. And I'd love to connect you with my dad at some point. I love that. He has also a very big collection, which he used to use to teach with, and I think it could help you as well. To go back to social media, but I really do think it was important to hear that from you, because so many people do not understand that. I would love, actually, I'm going to skip around a little bit. Do you think there's a grassroots movement and I think this does have to do with social media, but do you think there is a grassroots movement such as Black Lives Matter for the Jews? And if so, how would you describe the movement? And if there is not yet such a movement, how would you suggest we organize one? And what do you think the reaction would be?
I think there is one, but I don't think it looks the same. And I really think our movement is Jewish pride. And Jewish pride encapsulates all of this. It encapsulates advocating for ourselves, educating ourselves, combating all of the hate that we experience, of course, combating the shame that's imposed on us. I think that because of how we're perceived, it would be a very hard sell to the non-Jewish world. And ultimately, these movements, Black Lives Matter, is for non-Black people, right? Of course, it's for Black people to say, okay, we matter and we shouldn't be treated like this. But it's also to say to non-Black people, help us, stand with us, be our allies. And it's difficult because then you have to get into kind of how the language we use to talk about things. And in a way, it's marketing. But I think that because of how we are perceived, that would be very difficult. And we're also constantly shot down. You know, I coined a term last year called a race of anti-Semitism, where people literally erase the fact that anti-Semitism exists. I mean, people are de-Jewifying the Holocaust. So like, what hope do we have in getting them to understand what we're experiencing now? But I think Jewish pride is the movement. And it's not dissimilar necessarily, because Black Lives Matter is Black people, and we could talk about that specific organization and movement because it has its problems, but at its core, it's about Black people standing up and saying, no, we're not going to be treated like this. We're not going to accept it. And that's what Jewish pride is. And I think that Jewish pride is about positivity. It's about us loving ourselves and rejecting the shame and the hate from the outside world, because that's the first step. They're not going to change how they view us if we're not able to stand for ourselves. And this is not about, some people say, oh, the non-Jewish world hates weak Jews, or they hate trembling Jews. I think it's more that they just won't know the facts because we're not going to talk about it. We have to advocate for ourselves. We have to educate them. We have to share our experiences, dialogue with them. And I do think that Jewish pride, that is our movement. And something is happening online. Something has happened online in grassroots spaces, or at grassroots level, where we are kind of throwing off these shackles that have, been around our arms and legs for literally thousands of years. And we're saying, no, we love being Jewish. We're not going to be ashamed of it. Being Jewish is like the best thing ever, and we love it, and we're going to celebrate it, and we're going to cultivate it, and we're going to pass it on to the next generation who are also going to love it. And part of that means not tolerating all of this BS that we're receiving. But I think at its core, it's about self-love.
I love that, and I agree. With a wider frame, we get hundreds of messages asking us to debunk various libels about Israel and debunk, anything you can think of. I'm sure you're getting the same messages as well. And of course, none of us have the resources to debunk every anti-Semitic statement, every lie about Israel. But we're getting a lot of questions requesting some good information and countering most of the common libels, specifically false claims about colonization, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid. What is your advice to those who are asking for this information?
It's really hard because I try to answer my DMs. Firstly, because I hate seeing the notifications. I'm the person that has 0 emails in their inbox. It gives me anxiety. So I try to, but yeah, sometimes they send you streams and streams of text, and it is difficult. I would say that, maybe this is our community has to organize. Maybe we need to start putting on conferences. Maybe we have to start, actually educating people, and people of our generation, because, okay, yeah, we can train the teachers who are going to be educating the little kids, but what about us? None of us are in school anymore. Or if we are, we're not students necessarily. So I think that we just need to understand, people also have to do their own research. We have to also encourage people to kind of take responsibility for their own learning, but that is hard because there's so much misinformation out there. But I think it's about looking at the bare bones of the facts. Like, what is genocide? Like, what is the actual definition of genocide? Does it involve population growth? No, it does not. There's equal sign with the line through it. Not the same. So there's that. Colonization. Well, we have to get into conversations about, can you colonize what is historically your land? And also we can criticize the Israeli government, and there's certain things the Israeli government does that I'm like, I'm not sure about that. But also I'm kind of almost like, I don't care because I'm not an Israeli.
It's also any country. It doesn't matter what country it is. Of course,
yeah, it's a bit rich. People from Britain or America talking about colonialism, is it? It's like, girl, like those in glass houses, Britain, like shut up. Like these British professors in these universities built for money from the empire. Are you kidding me? And actually also built for money stolen from us. This is also something we don't talk about. The economic exploitation of Jews was the reason Europe got wealthy. Who built the Colosseum? It was the Jews. What happened to the money taken from the Jews of England after 1290? It was taken by the king. So we were economically segregated and exploited, and that built the wealth of Europe and then later America. The court Jews were an extension of that. So those in glass houses certainly shouldn't be throwing stones, but we have to just understand our own history. Like the fact that there are Jews who do not understand that we're indigenous to the Levant, I find to be very troubling. Like, we're not Polish. Like, what are you talking about? Even Yiddish has Hebrew letters. It's just, there is a cognitive disconnect between the facts and the narrative. and we have to be educating about the facts, and it has to really be a multifaceted approach. So people have to do their own research, absolutely, but we as a community need to organize. We have resources. We're very lucky that we're a community that has some resources, and we care very deeply about education. So we should start, really focusing on it. And I think that the Jewish organizations, the very powerful Jewish organizations, need to kind of take a bit of a step back and think, okay, what are we spending our money on? And how do we use our resources to advance the next generation? Because I see the fact we're caretakers. Jewishness doesn't belong to us. We're looking after it for the next generation who will look after it for the next generation. And that's an enormous responsibility. And if we're not properly educated, then they will not be properly educated. And it takes 1 or 2 generations for a civilization to be destroyed. So it's a very difficult question you've asked, because it's like, do your own research, follow our Instagram accounts, of course, read Wider Frame, read books, but also we as a community need to start kind of getting our heads together and think, how can we actually be supporting people in a really meaningful way that is providing high quality education? Because as a teacher, I am a little snooty about Instagram accounts. Not yours, of course, not mine, of course, but there's people like, I have a Wi-Fi connection, I'm an educator, and I'm like, do you though? Are you though? Like, no, you're not. You are an activist, and that's great. I don't see myself as an activist. I'm an educator and an author. And I think that we have to start kind of elevating, maybe this is a self-plug, elevating voices that are really doing the groundwork, doing the actual work, understand what it means to write a lesson, understand what it means to plan a curriculum. Because I see misinformation constantly from accounts who are kind of framing themselves as educational, which is endless.
I see it all the time. Do you?
So annoying.
Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, but on that note, do you think that Jews have a responsibility to fight back on social media, or that we should?
Yeah, we should, and just for self-respect, because we're a people who matter. We matter just as much as anyone else, and we're not going to roll over and take it, and we actually never have. There's these misconceptions about the Jewish history that we've just accepted and acquiesced, and accepted what has been done to us. It's not true. In the Shoah, there was countless revolts, and at different times in our history, either physically, either spiritually, in whatever way. So we absolutely do, just because that is us stating our claim to self-determination. And whether we reach just other Jews or some non-Jews, that is, it depends who's following you, right? So it depends how you create your content. But we do have a responsibility to fight back, just because I'm not going to be spoken to like this and just be like, thanks. Like, people, the phrase that was used, people were making fun of our names. And Eve was called Eve Fartlow, and I was called Ben P-Man. And I first told my partner, and he started laughing, and I was like, it's not funny. And he's like, well, it's a little funny. I was like, yeah, it's a little funny when you're 5, but not when you're a 34-year-old author, And actually, we have to counter that. And whether it's counter it with humor, and part of me thinks I want to get a t-shirt that says Ben MP Man, or you counter it by just defending the Jewish people, or by continuously advocating for us in terms of countering claims, debunking, or just putting out, accurate information. We do have to. We're not victims. We have never been victims. We are an incredibly strong, resilient people who have experienced victimhood, but that is not the same thing. We've experienced victimization, but we're not victims. We fight back.
I think people are really scared about the sacrifice involved in speaking out. And I think, as your best friend Eve has said, just I think yesterday, instead of looking at it as a sacrifice, look at it as a personal investment, an investment in our people, an investment in our future. And that really stuck with me.
Absolutely. And I think that I've always felt this, and I think a lot of other Jewish people have. I've always understood that we're part of something bigger than us. This is not about us as individuals, not in what is expressed about us, but also it's not about us because, as I said, Jewishness doesn't belong to us. This is about caretaking it for the next generation. So each of us have a responsibility to caretake it, to stand up for ourselves, to advocate for it, because then there'll be nothing left. We have a responsibility. We're not going to be the generation We're not going to be the weak link, to quote the Prince of Egypt. We're going to advocate for ourselves. We're going to be strong, resilient, inspired, empowered, educated Jews. And it makes me feel good about myself. I really love being Jewish. Like, and it's not like a gimmick. I love it. I think it's so incredible that we're part of something that stretches back 4,000 years.
It's incredible.
And there's unbroken thread. That is remarkable. And actually, most people don't have that. So there's so much to celebrate.
There's a few questions from the audience that I want to get, because I think we have about 15 minutes left or less. How do we create constructive dialogues online and not diatribes? How do we bring back conversations?
I think that's a really important question. And I also think that it's something that is happening in the wider world. Like, we have moved away from dialogue, we've moved away from conversations, all populist and polarized speech. I think it's about, and it is difficult, it's about trying to see where people are engaging in good faith. Because sometimes people ask questions, sometimes people direct message me, and they're really wanting to know. And sometimes they actually might have a Palestinian flag in their bio, which generally means that they're a specific type of person. But if they reach out and they really seem to be wanting to know, I'll be like, sure, I'll answer you. Alternatively, you get people who want to engage in bad faith and who call you Ben MP man, or just do Palestinian flags under your thing that has nothing to do with the Palestinians, you know. So it is frustrating, and we might also get it wrong. I sometimes get it wrong. I sometimes react maybe badly to people who are trying to engage in good faith, but I've had a bad day and there's been a lot of hate. And that's also something we have to talk about. We have to be kind to ourselves. It's okay to take a break. It's okay to step away. But I think trying to see where there is dialogue, where people are wanting to have dialogue with you, and also reaching out to others, because kind of actually similarly to Israel with the Palestinians, that you have to have a partner for peace. And you can do as much as you can do, but if the person you're speaking to is not interested, then there isn't going to be a dialogue, but we have to be open to it. So reaching out to people, commenting on Instagram posts, commenting on Twitter threads, hey, I'd love to explore this with you more. But it's also exhausting. And it's also, for the most part, people are not necessarily interested in that, but sometimes you find a couple of gems.
How do you think we get people, do you think people will ever care? Non-Jews, that is?
Yeah, what I'm about to say is a bit depressing, so wait for it, guys. Yeah, they'll care when they've murdered all of us again, and then they'll be like, oh my God, what happened? How did we do this? Because of what it says about them, not what it says about us, and not how we're being treated. We saw this after the Holocaust. Oh my God, it's so terrible. What are we seeing now less than 100 years later? I think that this is, it's not, I'm not going to say it's our lot in life, because I don't know, that makes me feel uncomfortable, but there is a reality that historically and continuing to this day, they don't care. And maybe it might change in the future, for sure. But I think my perspective is you learn, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And I think the Holocaust is a really wonderful example of this, or post-Holocaust actually, because everyone was so shocked, but not because they cared about Jews, but because of how could they have allowed this to happen? How could this have happened in their world? And now we're seeing what we're seeing today. So maybe, sorry, I guess the answer is no, I don't think so. So sorry, everyone, if you were looking for something a bit more empowering and inspiring.
Another question just came in. How do we address non-Jewish friends who aren't supporting anti-Semitism in the same way or at all really that they supported other anti-racist movements?
So I've had very difficult conversations with friends where I've basically called them up and been like, you're being a terrible friend. And some friends don't post on social media at all, and some friends reach out privately, and that's fine. But I do, the ones who posted black squares, the ones who post about anti-Asian hate or about Islamophobia or LGBTQ plus phobia, and who say nothing about anti-Jewish hate, yeah, we should call them out. And also, I think this is a difficult thing, but we're also allowed to walk away from relationships that are not fruitful. I've walked away from friendships in the past year because I'm like, I'm not going to be an advocate online and accept people in my actual life not standing up for me. But whilst they stand up for other people, not everyone's going to care as much as we care. Like, people are busy, you know, everyone is getting on with their lives. But yes, if you're someone who cares about social justice and your silence on Jews, we have the conversation, and it's about really talking about how it's impacting us. Like, I've cried down the phone to non-Jewish friends being like, do you understand what this is like? This is racism. This is not just trolls online. They're targeting me and people like me by the thousands because we're Jews. And that is not a separate side of me. It is all of me, just as my LGBTQ plusness is all of me. So you cannot advocate for me and love me and see me as your friend or someone important in your life while disregarding a major aspect of my identity, which is being abused by people. So I think we're allowed, again, advocate for yourself, have the conversation, talk about how it impacts you emotionally, but be aware that some people aren't going to respond in the way that you want them to, and that you're allowed to walk away.
And it's painful. It's painful
Yeah.
to have these conversations and then to walk away ultimately. It's
Yeah,
a loss, and it's a loss that we have to grieve as well, on top of everything else, on top of being terrorized and tormented about what's going on. Okay. Most, if not all of us have been stuck at home with very limited in-person social interaction. We've been asked to pick just a handful of friends to see over the last year. How do you think the lack of diversity in friendships could have a role in what we are seeing right now?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I would say it's not necessarily COVID. It's the fact that we're just in general a tiny minority. There's 14.7 million Jews in the world. So there's many, many people, I mean, millions of people, perhaps even billions, who have never even met a Jew. So that is something that does play an impact, right? Because then people have never met a real life Jewish person, so they believe all the tropes. And this is where actually the non-Jewish world have to educate. They need to be accurately educating about all groups of people, about the Black experience, the Asian experience, and the Jewish experience. And I have had interactions recently where very expensive private schools in Britain and America are refusing to engage with Jewishness, with Jewish stories, with anti-Semitism, while falling over themselves to talk about anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism or show themselves as LGBTQ plus allies, which is, well, firstly, they've failed as educators, and it's racist. Let's just call it for what it is. They're erasing us, they're excluding us because we're Jews and because they see us as privileged and powerful. Well, that is a modern manifestation of anti-Jewish racist ideas. And it's incredibly frustrating. So what we need to do is raise our voices and hope that some non-Jewish people will hear them. And for me, the way I try to curate my content is I don't want non-Jewish people to feel judged or blamed. They live in worlds which have taught them how to view Jews in specific ways. So actually, it's not really their fault if they do. Hopefully they'll be open, and hopefully they'll have the humility to say, oh, maybe my experience or my perspective is not the only perspective or the right perspective. But it's about education and being open rather, I think, than just these interactions via COVID. But I think we face so many uphill battles just because of the nature of our community. And some of them are not necessarily rooted in badness. I mean, what can we do about 14.7 million?
So to that point, this was an earlier question I had, but I think it's relevant here. Regarding anti-Semitism that comes from other marginalized communities, such as the gay community, the Squad, BLM, people are afraid to speak out against this or address it precisely because it's coming from groups that also face discrimination. How do we address and combat this anti-Semitic agenda and messaging without undermining the fight for equality for all?
We're sensitive, but we do it in the way we would any other. We're not special. We're just as good and bad as anyone else. And that applies to all minority groups. And actually, I think it's a little racist for us to be like, oh, Black people cannot be prejudiced, or Asian people or LGBTQ plus people. Of course they can. Jews can. Everyone can. And I do think that, yes, of course, we want to understand power dynamics, but a person living in the world, a gay person living in the world who, talks about queers for Palestine is A, an idiot, and B, we deal with it in the same way. We deal with it through education, we deal with it through advocacy, and we deal with it through combating. And of course, we're not going to go into slurs. We're not going to be like, hey, you F words, stop that. We're not going to use that because, we're going to conduct ourselves with dignity, and be respectful, but we're not going to shy away from these conversations. Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, they are racist. And I'm not American, so I feel comfortable saying this. They are racist. And I don't care what their other identity is. And we're not going to utilize their identities to harm them or to combat this. But we're certainly not going to shy away from calling it out. Louis Farrakhan has done enormous damage. He created an entire myth that we finance the slave trade. Are we just supposed to stay silent about that?
Because we're not the real Jews. That's another myth.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. Are we just meant to stay silent because he's a black man? No, we're not going to be racist in our response, but we're certainly not going to shy away. And I think that we, again, need to empower ourselves. We're allowed to advocate for ourselves in the way that everyone else is allowed to.
There's two more questions. I'm going to ask them both. I know we only have a few minutes, and if you can touch on them both briefly. Number one, from the audience, how do you separate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism? And number two, how do we address our fellow Jews who don't speak up at all or who support the Palestinians?
So I think that, dealing with criticism of Israel, it's totally fine, and we should, in the way that you would any other country. We also have to recognize that we're defensive. I am for sure defensive anytime someone criticizes Israel, because really I think 90% of comments on Israel are rooted in anti-Jewish hate. But we also have to encourage and explain how we can do it. And it's the 3D test by Natan Sharansky. So we ask ourselves, does a statement or whatever, does it demonize Israel? Does it delegitimize Israel? Or does it treat it with double standards? And if someone is saying, listen, I disagree with the settlements, and I also disagree with this thing the Palestinians have done and this thing the Arab leaders have done, you're like, okay, cool, fair. But if someone is like, I disagree with this and everyone else is perfect, then it's like, well, A, you're an idiot, and B, that's racist. And then the second question, I think we're at a critical point now. And I used to want to be a diplomat, and it's actually not in my nature to be very diplomatic. So people would always laugh at me when I told them. But the time for, I think, diplomacy is coming to an end. And I'm not advocating for physical violence. What I'm saying is the time for softly is over, including with our fellow Jews. We need to say to people, wake up. Do you think by being a good Jew, Seth Rogen, they're going to spare you? Do you think it's not going to allow the rest of us to be harmed? No, it's contributing to the hate that is piling on us day by day. You may not understand that, so let's educate in a non-judgmental, in a kind of very open space. That's a safe space for people to learn, because internalized anti-Semitism is a manifestation of systemic embedded hate. So actually, for the most part, it's not people's fault. But we have to stop saying to people, or we have to start saying to people, speak out, use your voice, even if it's just coming to events like this, even if it's just supporting Jewish organizations like the Jewish Federation or Jewish publications like A Wider Frame. Raise your voice and advocate in any way that you can. And we all have different resources, but the time for staying silent is over. And we have seen this historically. We're not going to go the same way that other Jewish communities have gone. We're not going to allow it. And the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And until the non-Jewish world, show us that we can trust them, we're not going to necessarily, and we're not going to allow for this keep your head down policy to fester in our community, because it's deeply unhealthy. People need to be educated and supported. Listen, we're not going to scare people and then be like, good luck. It's about creating safe spaces which empower people, support people, but also don't shy away from the truth.
Fantastic. Alexi, how much time, or Alyssa, do I have a few more minutes?
I think we should wrap up here. We're coming to the end. Okay. And Warren can close us out, but Ben, that was a beautiful way to wrap this all up and end.
Ben, thank you so much. Honestly, I could do this for another 3 hours with you tonight.
I know. You said, is there going to be another time for question? I was like, man, I got one just following yours, but we'll save it for another time.
One more minute. What's your question?
Yeah. Well, I was actually, Ben, you got such a clear, distinctive kind of personality style. So the way you started the comments about, having this identity of being a Jew and a very proud Jew, and then coming out, and I think it's relevant, obviously we're in Pride Month, and really this confronting two different personalities that were emerging. How did you face one personality that was an anti-Semitic partner of yours at the time, while still kind of maintaining this very proud Jewish identity, and just kind of that internal struggle?
Yeah, it's very difficult, and it was a struggle. And I think ultimately it was something that led me to being quite unhappy and to suppressing a part of myself. You know, I had a very, very difficult coming out experience, like many people and kind of many LGBTQ plus people in our age bracket did or do. And I was really so desperate to be in a relationship. And I met someone who was a poet, and he was from a Scottish island, and it was very romantic. And I didn't discover that he hated Jews on our first date, obviously. And I had fallen in love. And by the time I kind of realized, and I would just be like, okay, well, you know, that's a disagreement. That's a disagreement. And it took me, well, it took us breaking up, actually. We didn't even break up because of this, but it took us breaking up for me to kind of understand that you can't separate. They're not two different, they're one, and they're me. So the Jewish community has to support LGBTQ plus people because they're LGBTQ plus Jews. The LGBTQ plus community has to support Jewish people because there's LGBTQ plus Jews. And we have to see us as, I mean, I'm whole. So I love, you know, I love Yentl. Oh, no, actually, don't really. I love Funny Girl, which actually might be a little gay and Jewish, so I'll try and think of a better example. I love reading about the Holocaust or reading about Jewish history, and I also love Drag Race, and I also love Britney Spears, and they're not separate. They're one within me, and I think that we need to create space for that. And part of it is empowering people to be like, be Jewish the way you want to be Jewish. We cannot be inventing how we're going to be Jewish. There are rules. But I think we do need to create space, and because it damages us, and it damages us really from a mental health perspective and psychologically.
Yeah, thanks for letting me fit that question in real quick. And ultimately, thank you. You know, Ben, I know it's tomorrow in Hong Kong, and I just realized, Eden, you're on the East Coast, right? It's 11:30. So yeah, certainly appreciate you guys coming on and sharing your insights, and thank everybody in the community that dialed in to this educational conversation. I know it's Wednesday, everyone's zoomed out, but it's, obviously I think everyone here can agree that it was an extremely meaningful conversation. I personally took away 5 things. I mean, I was scribbling notes, like my hands sore, like back in, you know, high school, scribbling notes. But 5 big things. One is just, you know, Ben, you're an encyclopedia of Jewish history, so I learned so much about our own history. The second is not accepting the keep your head down policy. I think you mentioned it, which conceptually makes a lot of sense. Just kind of, you know, slugging on without really being a voice and being proud. The third is tapping into your online community, which both of you guys, I follow both of you guys, and obviously post amazing content, and I encourage everybody else to do the same. I'll give you their kind of hashtags and handles in a minute. Framing the Jewish pride grassroots movement, which makes so much in terms of the communication that's online. So I found all those extremely valuable, Ben, and Eden, your questions were really eloquent, very succinct, and very thoughtful. So thank you guys both. So the 2 resources, I'll just give you their handles because, you know, everybody's got a website, it's easy to find. So A Wider Frame and at Ben Freeman. I follow both. They're nothing short of fantastic. So everybody, thank you for dialing in tonight, tuning in to this very important conversation, and being members of the community, being proud Jews, most importantly. And stay tuned for the next BGS and Emerging Philanthropist event. So thanks again, and we'll talk soon.